Okay. After the War of 1812, we're going to get into the Monroe administration. Sometimes, as your book points out, it's called the era of good feelings, where we are pretty happy about what we have done with the war, how well we look abroad because we stood up to the British. And now things are going to turn to really the West. We're going to start seeing a lot of action out here. We're going to start dealing with some of the problems of moving west. And as you can kind of see as well from the slide here, our first political party is on its way out. And the Federalists are pretty soon going to be a dead party. The When you kind of think about this election and the Monroe administration, you're going to kind of see. Well, I told you guys we're going to start seeing some action down here in Florida and out here in the West. Okay, so Monroe is elected president. He will serve 2 terms. So he is elected in 1816. He's reelected in 1820. He is another Virginian. We have so far had Washington from Virginia. We've had Jefferson from Virginia. We've had Madison from Virginia. And now we have Monroe. So the Virginia dynasty is alive and kicking. The only exception, of course, was Adams, who was our second president. He was from Massachusetts. So Monroe is now in office. His Secretary of State is the future president, John Quincy Adams, undoubtedly one of America's best Secretary of States. He does a fantastic job in this position. Now, later, when we talk about his presidency, not so good. But Adams, as a Secretary of State, was fantastic. He will meet with the British, and in 1818, we will sign well, it's really called a Convention of 1818, but we will establish a permanent border between the United States and British occupied Canada for the Louisiana Purchase lands that runs from the Lake of the Woods here to the boundary of the Oregon country. Now, they don't negotiate the boundary through the Oregon country. They should have, but neither side does. The Americans, us, we believe the boundary for the Oregon country to be way up here, that this should be American territory. The British actually think it should be down here. So eventually it's going to settle right here. I know that that's going to be ridiculous when we talk about it later, but the Oregon country's border is still in dispute. But we do settle this border, and that's important. The other thing that Adams will do is, and here's a better picture of it. So we think the boundary's way up here. The British actually think it's way down here. We'll eventually settle on it right here, which was what we should have done in the first place. Now you guys can see the United States in about 1819, and we will use some leverage now to try to settle these boundaries between us and Spain. And one of the things that we're going to kind of deal with is Florida. The uh, the Florida situation is tied up in what becomes the Transcontinental Treaty or the Adams and Nice Treaty in 1819. What we will do is we will use an incident provoked by future President Andrew Jackson, who essentially had taken a U.S. Army down here to Florida, which was Spanish territory. The Spanish did a miserable job of administering Florida. It had become a haven for everything from runaway slaves to pirates to criminals. And people would escape down here to Florida, cross over the border, terrorize people in Georgia and Alabama and those areas here, and then sink back. And we were really angry about it. So Jackson had essentially invaded Florida and caused some real bad feelings between us and Spain over Florida. So Adams uses this to his advantage. He tells the Spanish, look, we would like to settle this western border here between us and the Louisiana Purchase. If you will give us Florida, then we will actually give some land here along the Texas coast to Spain. So essentially, we trade some land right here for Florida, and we put the pressure on Spain. And we tell Spain, and Adams tells Spain that, look, if you don't do this, we're going to send Jackson back down here to Florida, and we're going to take it anyway. So the Spanish decide that this will be a good idea. And so in 1819, we will settle through treaty this western boundary here and get control of Florida. The Adams and Nice Treaty and the Convention of 1818 now have settled most of these western boundaries for a while. It's true that the American population is beginning to move west. And as more land opens up out here, more settlers are going to be pushing out in the Ohio River Valley and further west. So Henry Clay, who was from Kentucky, you guys know Kentucky is right here, developed a plan that he called the American system. Clay decided that what we should do to encourage Western growth, which was good for his state, by the way, was to put a tariff in place, use those funds to make internal improvements, including roads, bridges, canals, all sorts of things that would link the West to the East and thus make goods and people moving west to east or east to west easier. He also proposed the creation of another bank in the United States to deal with the monies from the tariff and to help with these internal improvements. Here you can kind of see some of the roads that were proposed. And notice what you would do here essentially is link the Mississippi River by road through some of these areas out to the Atlantic. So you would be able to move goods from the east to the west and west to east. And this would be good for these western states, including Kentucky, because the Ohio River runs through here. And it would be good to be able to take goods off of the road and into Ohio and then out along the Mississippi. This is when the Erie Canal was proposed and built, uh, and you see some pretty big construction projects as a result. This is also a problem. The American system, Clay's American system, leads to some questions. If you look at it, the West would get roads, canals, federal aid, things that they needed. The East would get tariffs that would protect their business and would get more business by being able to move goods easily out into the West. What did the South get? And many Southerners and Southern leaders look at this and go, hey, we're not getting anything out of this. A higher tariff will make it more difficult for us to trade our cotton. There's nothing here for us. And Southern congressional leaders, senators are going to look at this like John C. Calhoun and say, I don't think I really like this a whole lot. It's the beginning of really sectionalism that will eventually lead us into war. One of the big problems that Monroe faces in 1819 is a panic, a depression. You can read about the Panic of 1819. These happen in cycles, and chapter 9 in the textbook will tell you a little bit about the Panic of 1819 and its impacts. Ordinarily, this would doom a president, but you guys can see that Monroe easily wins re-election in 1820. So easily, it's almost unanimous. So easily, only one person cast a vote for John Quincy Adams, but essentially it is virtually unanimous. And the Federalist Party is done. The old Federalist Party that had really been centered up here in New England is essentially done. You'll also notice that we are starting to see some new states come in. Missouri is one, and Missouri is on the verge of becoming a state. And this is going to cause a big problem. I told you guys that the South was a little bit concerned about the situation. And one of the things that they were concerned about is eventually a loss of power, a loss of political power in the Senate and in the House. They already were in trouble because the population centers are going to be moving up here. These areas are very rural in the South. But in the Senate, everybody was equal. And in 1820, the balance of power was equal. There was just as many southern areas, southern states, as there were northern states. The problem is that what are we going to do about new states coming in? And Maine up here was ready to come in and become a new state. Missouri was ready to become a new state. There are real problems about what's going to happen in these new states, especially with the expansion of slavery. Slavery is about to become our major issue. So in 1820, as Missouri kind of became prepared to come into the state or come into the Union, there was a real problem about what to do with Maine and Missouri and these states. And Southerners wanted to make sure they preserved the balance of power. They also wanted Missouri to come in because Missouri decided that it was going to come in as a slave state. The free states up here, the states that really had no use for slavery, don't necessarily like that. So Henry Clay has to craft a compromise. Missouri would come in as a slave state. Maine would come in as a free state. And from here on out, you see this line right here? This is the Missouri Compromise line. Okay, the Compromise of 1820 is sometimes called the Missouri Compromise. Anything above this line would be organized as free. Anything below this line could come in potentially as a slave state. So the Missouri Compromise is our first real, and Jefferson called it the fire bell in the night, our first real controversy about slavery and what's going to happen in the future. Here's a great example. Okay, some of the fight over the Missouri Compromise involved something like the Talmadge Amendment, which was proposed all slaves born in Missouri after the territory became a state would be freed by 25. Okay, the South was able to block it in the Senate, but the Missouri statehood bill almost included an amendment that would have freed the slaves in Missouri at the age of 25. This is a real issue, okay, about the expansion of slavery. Last thing that Monroe does as president is make an announcement to Europe that this is our hemisphere. But the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, and you'll need to read a little bit about this, pretty much tells Europe that this is our hemisphere and to stay out of it. We will deal with anything that goes on in this hemisphere. You're not going to come over here and colonize this hemisphere any longer. So, if you will go and kind of read about that in the textbook, it'll become a little bit clearer. All right, real quick, okay, we are going to skip from here to the election of 1824. Okay, and we're going to get into the Jackson administration in the next video. All right, see you guys.